Maybe this will explain why you don't belong in this family. Vanessa's voice cut through the reunion just before a white envelope slapped against the table in front of me. 20 relatives went silent. I looked down at the pages that had spilled halfway out. Laboratory header, genetic comparison, then the sentence that made my stomach tighten. The tested individuals were not consistent with a biological father-daughter relationship. Vanessa folded her arms and smiled. You're another man's mistake, Geogina. A few people shifted in their chairs. Someone near the end of the table whispered my name. My mother, Margaret, went completely pale. But my father didn't look at me. Charles looked straight at Vanessa. Where did you get the sample? Vanessa blinked, then laughed. That's what you're worried about. I asked you a question. Her smile widened. From your old grooming kit upstairs. That was when my father stood so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. You have absolutely no idea what you've just touched. And suddenly, I wasn't sure the DNA test was the most dangerous thing on that table. Vanessa had been building toward this all afternoon. She had made comments about my nose, my height, the fact that I didn't resemble Dad as much as she did. You've always looked different, she'd said while pouring herself another drink. I ignored her. At 32, I'd spent most of my life learning that Vanessa loved an audience. She was 35, the favored daughter, the one our parents trusted with family decisions. Everyone expected her to eventually help manage Grandma Evelyn's estate. I was the quieter sister, the one relatives compared to Vanessa and then looked disappointed when I didn't compete. But this was different. Vanessa tapped the report. Maybe now we can stop pretending everything should be divided like she's actually an Addams. There it was. Not just humiliation. Inheritance. Several relatives looked from the DNA test to me as though my seat at the table had suddenly become questionable. Dad's expression hardened. Vanessa, stop. Why? She shot back. If Grandma left family property to family, shouldn't we know who actually qualifies? Mom whispered, please. Vanessa ignored her. I picked up the report. For 1 second, she looked almost disappointed that I wasn't crying. So I folded the pages neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and smiled. If you wanted a reaction, I said, standing, you picked the wrong sister. Then I walked out. For the next 7 days, the family group chat became a courtroom. Some relatives defended me, others asked whether Grandma's estate needed to be reconsidered. Vanessa barely spoke. She didn't need to. She had already planted the question. Then, exactly 1 week after the reunion, my phone rang. Martin Hale, estate attorney. Grandma Evelyn's lawyer had handled our family documents for years, and Martin was not a man who sounded rattled. That morning, he did. Geogina. Yes. Ma'am, I need you back at the house immediately. I sat up. What happened? There was a pause. Then Martin said, bring the DNA report, and don't discuss this with Vanessa before you arrive. The call ended. I stared at my phone, one thought pounding louder than everything else. What had my sister's DNA test uncovered that frightened our estate lawyer more than it frightened me? I didn't go straight to Grandma Evelyn's house. I went to my parents'. Dad was already in the kitchen when I walked in. Mom stood near the sink, gripping a dish towel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. I placed Vanessa's DNA report on the counter between us. Are you my father? Dad looked at me for several seconds. Then he said, I am your father, but that is exactly the question you're asking. My chest tightened. Mom looked down. That was all the confirmation I needed. I turned toward her. You knew. She swallowed. Geogina. How long? Dad answered. Since before you were born. I stared at him. The strange part was, the DNA result itself was what hurt most. It was the reunion. Vanessa had humiliated me in front of 20 relatives, called me another man's mistake, questioned whether I deserved anything from Grandma's estate, and my parents had sat there knowing there was an explanation. "You let her do that," I said. Dad stepped forward. "It wasn't that simple. You could have stopped her." "I tried." "No, you told her to stop. You didn't tell her she was wrong." Mom's eyes filled. Dad lowered his voice. "Because the truth involves someone who died before you were born. It was never just my story to tell." I pushed the DNA report toward him. "Then start with this." He picked it up. At first, he read silently. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. "What?" He turned the page around and pointed to the sample description. "Hair recovered from an antique shaving and grooming case." Dad looked at me sharply. "She said she got this from upstairs." "Yes." "The silver case." "I think so." He went still. Mom whispered, "Charles." Dad ignored her. "She took the silver grooming case from the upstairs storage cabinet." "Yes." He dropped the report onto the counter and grabbed his keys. I followed him toward the hallway. "What is going on?" He stopped at the door. "That case had my initials on it." "So?" His jaw tightened. "It wasn't originally mine." Before I could ask whose it was, the doorbell rang. Dad opened the door. Vanessa stood there with her arms crossed. "Martin called me too," she said. "I don't know why everyone's acting like I committed a crime. I proved what I proved." Dad slowly lifted the DNA report between them. Then he stepped aside. "Get in the car." Vanessa frowned. "Excuse me." Dad's voice turned cold. "You're going to learn whose DNA you actually stole." Grandma Evelyn's house wasn't empty when we arrived. Martin had called the immediate family back. The same house where Vanessa had humiliated me a week earlier now felt completely different. Martin stood near the dining table with several folders arranged in front of him. Vanessa walked in first. "Can we settle this?" she said. "The test says Geogina is Dad's biological daughter. Grandma's estate was meant for the Addams family. If Grandma was deceived, that matters." Martin didn't react. "Show me exactly where you obtained the comparison sample." Vanessa pointed upstairs. "The storage cabinet, Dad's old silver grooming case." Dad immediately headed upstairs. Minutes later, he returned carrying a tarnished silver case. Vanessa pointed at it. "That one." Dad placed it on the table. "My initials are on the lid because this eventually became mine." He turned the case over. Near the bottom was a faded engraving I had never noticed. "N.A." Martin looked at Vanessa. "Do you know what those initials mean?" She hesitated. Dad answered. "Nathan Addams." I looked at him. "Who's Nathan?" "My older brother." The room went quiet. Dad rested one hand against the case. "When Nathan died, some of his belongings passed to me. This was one of them." Vanessa's expression changed. For the first time since the reunion, she looked uncertain. I stared at the DNA report. So the sample she submitted wasn't necessarily mine, Dad said. Vanessa immediately pushed back. "Fine, but the test still proves Geogina isn't your biological daughter." Martin nodded. "Yes." Vanessa almost smiled again. Then Martin continued. "But nobody involved in Evelyn Addams's estate ever claimed that she was." Mom covered her mouth. Vanessa stared at him. "What?" Martin reached into his briefcase and removed an old sealed file. The paper had yellowed around the edges. "I need to confirm the trust's disclosure provisions before I open this." Vanessa stepped closer. Grandma knew. Martin didn't answer. Mom turned away, wiping her face. I looked from her to Dad, then down at the initials on that silver case. Nathan Addams. A dead uncle I barely remembered hearing about. A DNA sample Vanessa thought belonged to my father. And an estate lawyer holding a file that apparently existed long before my sister decided to investigate me. I looked directly at Martin. Then who was Nathan Adams to me? Martin glanced at Dad before resting his hand on the sealed file. That, he said, is exactly why your grandmother created this file. Martin didn't open the file. Not yet. Instead, he looked directly at Vanessa. Before we discuss Geogina's parentage, you need to understand why your actions created an estate issue. Vanessa folded her arms. I ordered a DNA test. You removed material from inventoried property inside this residence without authorization. Her arms slowly dropped. Martin opened another folder and slid an old inventory sheet across the table. Beside a description of the silver grooming case was one name: Nathaniel Nathan Adams. Vanessa stared at it. Martin continued. Then you publicly claimed Geogina had been fraudulently included among Evelyn Adams's beneficiaries. Once that allegation reached me, I was required to verify the trust records. I looked at Dad. His reaction at the reunion finally made sense. He hadn't panicked because Vanessa had discovered I wasn't biologically his. He had panicked because he knew exactly where that silver case had come from. Nathan died months before you were born, Dad said quietly. I turned toward him. Grandma knew about me. Yes. Before he died. Dad nodded. Vanessa suddenly leaned forward. Wait, if Nathan knew she existed then. Vanessa, Martin interrupted, stop guessing. He placed the sealed estate file in front of us. The commercial DNA test is not the final proof of anything. Evelyn anticipated that Geogina's parentage might someday be questioned. My mother closed her eyes. Martin removed 3 sealed documents and laid them side by side. He pointed to the first, Nathan Adams's acknowledgement of paternity. Then the second, Charles Adams's subsequent legal parentage documentation. His finger moved to the third, and Evelyn Adams's trust instructions. Vanessa reached toward them. Martin immediately pulled the documents back. You don't touch these. She froze. Then Martin delivered the part Vanessa clearly hadn't expected. Because you attempted to use disputed parentage to influence another beneficiary's rights, your planned appointment as successor trustee is suspended pending formal review. Vanessa's face drained. My appointment. Yes. For the first time since she threw that DNA test at me, my sister wasn't looking at me like I was the one about to lose my place in the family. She was looking at Martin as if she had finally realized she might lose hers. Before anyone could say another word, footsteps hurried through the hallway. Martin's assistant entered carrying a thick leather ledger. She placed it carefully on the table. We found it, she said. Martin looked up. The original. She nodded. Evelyn's original trust ledger. Then she looked directly at me. And we found her instructions concerning Geogina. Martin opened Grandma Evelyn's ledger and placed it beside the 3 preserved documents. Nobody interrupted him this time. The truth is straightforward, he said, but it was kept private for a very long time. He opened Nathan's acknowledgement first. Years before I was born, my mother, Margaret, had been with Nathan Adams, Dad's older brother. Mom finally looked at me. I was already pregnant when Nathan died. Martin nodded, and Nathan knew. Before his death, Nathan had signed a formal acknowledgement that the unborn child was his. That child was me. I looked at Charles. So you knew from the beginning? Yes. After Nathan died, Charles eventually married Mom. He legally became my father and raised me from birth. Suddenly, his answer in the kitchen made perfect sense. He was my father. He just wasn't my biological father. And there had never been some mysterious outsider whose existence made me another man's mistake. My biological father was Nathan Adams. I was an Adams all along. Vanessa stared at the DNA report. But the test doesn't establish what you claimed, Martin said. You believed you were comparing Geogina's DNA against Charles's. The biological material you removed came from Nathan's grooming case. He tapped the estate inventory. You accidentally found evidence consistent with a family history Evelyn had already documented. Vanessa's lips parted, but nothing came out. Martin opened Grandma's trust instructions. There's more. He turned the ledger toward us and pointed to an entry. Nathan's portion of the family assets had been preserved for his acknowledged child. The beneficiary was named explicitly. Geogina Adams. I read my own name twice. Vanessa finally found her voice. So she still gets Nathan's share. Martin looked at her. Geogina's inheritance was never dependent upon her being Charles's biological daughter. Evelyn knew precisely who her biological father was when these provisions were created. The room became painfully quiet. Then Martin addressed Vanessa's position. Grandma had required anyone serving as successor trustee to act impartially toward every beneficiary. Vanessa's attempt to use my parentage to challenge my rights created a conflict Martin was obligated to report. Her expected appointment was withdrawn. A neutral professional trustee would administer the estate instead. Vanessa wasn't disowned. Grandma's independent inheritance to her remained hers. But the thing Vanessa had expected to control, the family estate, was gone. She sat down slowly. A week earlier, she had thrown that DNA report at me as though it were an eviction notice from my own family. Now it lay untouched beside Grandma's ledger. I turned toward Charles. Why didn't you tell me? He took several seconds to answer. Because I was afraid that if you knew Nathan was your biological father, you'd look at the 32 years I spent being your dad and think they mattered less. I shook my head. The truth wouldn't have made you less my father. Hiding it made me question whether you trusted me with my own life. He looked down. You're right. No excuses followed. I'm sorry, Geogina. Mom apologized too. I didn't pretend one conversation repaired 32 years of silence. And when relatives who had repeated Vanessa's accusation began calling me, I didn't pretend every apology deserved immediate forgiveness either. I accepted some. I ignored others. With Mom and Charles, I set boundaries and allowed trust to rebuild slowly. With Vanessa, something more permanent had changed. We remained civil when family gatherings required it, but the relationship we once had was finished. Months later, Nathan's protected estate share passed to me under the provisions Grandma had established years earlier. I kept one unexpected thing from that week. The DNA report. Not because Vanessa had been right. Because in trying to use it to prove I didn't belong, she had forced open the door to a truth my family should have trusted me with years earlier. I learned who Nathan was. And I finally understood Charles differently too. Not as the man whose DNA determined whether I could call him Dad, but as the man who had chosen to raise his brother's daughter from the day she was born. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for Vanessa, or anyone else, to decide whether I belonged. Vanessa threw a DNA test at me to prove I wasn't an Adams. In the end, all she proved was that my grandmother had known exactly who I was long before my sister decided I didn't belong.